Okay, so the first question that I got was from Alan, and it talks about wind effects. How does potential wind effects alter the simplified 45-degree angle distances used for the survey? Um, and yes, Alan, if you do have high winds, parts can be transported over some distance. There have been surveys done that looked under all conditions over a long period of time. The fall distance from the tree over a broad range of conditions. And they found out that almost everything fell within 1.5 times the tree height. And if you were in a situation where you were expecting high winds or whatever, you might want to extend your range to 1.5 tree heights. Most of this sort of risk analysis that is involved in hazard tree appraisal does not necessarily take into account every conceivable situation. What we're doing really is trying to get rid of the unlikely things. And there have been a couple of different situations that looked at research papers, excuse me, I said situations, but have looked at how far statistically trees fall. And a good rule of thumb is just a tree height. And we're just using that as a risk analysis tool. It does not necessarily include all potential possible situations. Okay, so Jack asks about qualitative numeric assessments and referring that back to the ISA tree risk assessment and asking about some mathematical things related to the way that we're totaling up our total hazard tree rating. Okay, so Jack, I don't know if this is going to entirely answer the question, but the fundamental difference in between this sort of a hazard tree appraisal system, which is designed to look at a lot of trees in a fairly short period of time, our focus is going to be on evaluating an entire recreation area as quickly and effectively as we can. We're not going to get ever into the level of detail and probably actually not the level of quality that a really detailed ISA procedure would get you to. We're more focused on volume in this thing and doing it quickly, but as well as we can. So quite frankly, it's not going to be as accurate as if you take the time to go through the whole ISA process. And hopefully that answers that for you. Okay, so at this point, we're going to get into some specifics. And we're going to get into practicing with the form and just giving you an idea of how that works. I'm going to also put this plug-in at the end, but I'm going to mention it here. In this kind of a format, showing you guys a PowerPoint, am I going to actually be able to teach you how to evaluate hazard trees to the best of my knowledge? Nope. I can talk about some of the background materials, show you some slides, but in order to actually get out there on the ground and rate tree hazards, you need to get out and get your hands on some trees. And this only can really be taught on the ground around some trees. So I encourage people who are forest health protection customers to get a hold of me, and I'll give the contact information at the end. But this really cannot entirely be taught. It needs a follow-up session where we get out and we get our hands on some trees. Okay, so let's get into it here. All right, a couple of backbone points here, background points. Dead trees for our evaluation system are always going to have a failure potential rating of 4, and that's invariable. There actually is a pretty fair amount of variation amongst different tree species, also under different conditions, at which the rate at which dead trees fall. And for example, the ponderosa pine that you're looking at on the left there are going to fall much quicker than the bristlecone pine on the right. But the process of hazard tree appraisal, is a risk management type approach. And in either scenario, the potential for that tree to be falling, if it's dead, still maxes out. So dead trees, always a 4, and we're not going to be changing that. Okay, so talking about interacting defects, and the way that we're approaching that is if you have interacting defects, basically you just bump it up 1 failure potential class. So if you have 2 interacting failure potential class 3, you take that to a 4, 2 interacting 2s, you bump that to a 3. And I'll walk you through an application of that. So what is actually interacting? And it's going to be a situation, physical proximity is going to make a difference, but also basically the physics of what's going on with the tree. So a leaning tree with some damage to the root system or the base, yes, those are interacting defects. As opposed to a situation where you have a dead top on a tree with root disease. No, fairly obviously, those are not interacting defects. So just because there's more than 1 defect on a tree does not necessarily mean that they're interacting. Okay, so just getting into the nuts and bolts of the hazard tree form here, I'd like to draw your attention to that box on the top. And that just is some housekeeping information. And I'll walk you through how we approach that. It's just location. I just put in some gobbledygook there. We're calling the site the Snack Bar Campground. The evaluator's name, the date, and page numbers if you need it. More importantly is that bottom line there. And that's some possible site factors that might be impacting all your ratings on this form. And things like soil and water, trees perhaps in a saturated location, trees standing in very moist soil are much more likely to tip over than trees in a firm, well-drained soil. Wet soil is just fundamentally weaker than well-drained soil. Wind exposure might enter into this. Something like a recent thinning or opening up of the area, changing the wind conditions, and also just fundamentally changing the wind dynamics of the group of trees. A wind-prone ridge or valley might have an impact on that. And also if you have prior information on diseases that are common on a particular site, you might include mention of that as well. So for example, we have a bench situation right here. There's been some blowdown with some butt rot noted in the past, and they're removing some grand fir that have Indian paint conchs. So all of those are different types of things that you might be noting in that particular line. Okay, so getting into the fields that deal with specific trees. First off, there's a couple of places where you could put unit and map number. And then the next 3 elements there, tree, tree species, and DBH. If you're recording all 3 of those pieces of information, basically you're making a unique tree identifier number that makes it easier for someone when they come back to know what tree that you're talking about. Okay, for example, we're in Unit 10, Map 1, Tree 1. The tree species is ponderosa pine, and the tree we're talking about is 12 inches in diameter. Okay, sound wood shell, we're only going to be using that particular column if it's a tree that we're going to be taking an increment coring or drilling on. So leave it blank if it's not appropriate. Failure potential is broken up into 2 parts. The left column is for the failure potential codes that you'll find on the back of the data sheet. And the right is basically summarizing those into the worst failure potential. And that's the code that you're going to use when you actually total up your hazard tree rating. The failed column is for trees that need immediate attention. Basically, if you mark in that column, you're saying that this is a tree that's on its way to the ground. Somebody come and deal with it right away. And then we have the damage potential, target value, and the total rating. Okay, so in this case, for example, we had a dead tree. So dead trees always going to be maxed out failure potential. And that's the one case where you actually write out the word dead. and damage potential and target value were both maxed out. So we're going to get a total rating of 10. Now we're going to talk about the recommended actions portion of the form. And they're relatively simple. There might be a few cases where you're talking about pruning, but most of the time that's not something that we functionally do in a natural resources setting. I've only seen a couple of cases where that's actually been accomplished effectively. So our main actions are going to be remove, monitor, or okay, basically saying that no action is needed. There's a place for comments where you can identify some particular biological features that you might be wanting to pay attention to. And then finally, a date of action. And that is critical because basically that's going to be taking all the information that you gathered prior to this, pulling it all together into action. Okay, so for this case, we're talking about removing the tree. We're making a comment that there are bark beetles present because those might be creating some more hazard trees. And then we're moving on. Okay, so detecting decays. These are some of the things that you're going to be looking for, and I'm going to build into the process of how we are talking about evaluating decay here. One of the first things that you're going to be looking for is wounds. And when you have a wound, you can often quite simply look into the wound and see if there's decay present. You can detect cracks from the outside of the tree, whether they're open, whether they might be sealed. You can see conchs and fruiting bodies. You might also see patches of dead bark. Talking a little bit about tools here, and mostly wanted to draw your attention to an increment corer versus using a portable drill with long bits. And for those of you who aren't familiar with an increment corer, it's basically just a hollow hand-operated drill. You turn the handle over and it drills into the tree, and then you pull an extractor into it and pull out a sample of the wood. And I'll show you a picture of one of those here in just a few minutes. So when you do an increment coring, you have physical evidence of the fact you can pull it out, you can measure it, you can squish it with your fingernail and see if the decay is soft and squishy. You can use it in some cases to identify the decay. The problem, however, with increment corers is that it's quite slow, and the tool itself is quite expensive. For a larger drill bit on an increment core, it's hundreds of dollars. Versus a portable drill with some long, skinny drill bits, and you can accomplish that quite quickly. The problem with that is you don't have physical evidence. You're going much more on touch and feel. As you drill into the tree, you can tell textural differences in the wood strength-wise, and you can also just basically stick your hand underneath where you're drilling and catch some wood and look at it and see if it looks decayed. But mostly you're going on touch and feel, and it is an acquired skill. Those are some other necessary tools, and as we go through the process of doing this, I think that it's going to be pretty evident why we might want to have these tools. But I did want to point out coring versus a drilling. Okay, one other thing that you can do in detecting decay is to sound for hollowness by striking the bowl. And you can do this with a mallet. They have special mallets that are made for this purpose, or with a hatchet or an axe. And what you're doing is basically checking to see if it has the hollow sound when you hit it with the axe or whatever. I've known people who are very good at this. Some old tree cruisers in some cases can tell you how much decay was in the tree down to a couple of percent, basically by sounding it with an axe. One of my colleagues from Boise is very good at this, sounding trees. Basically, despite spending 20 plus years evaluating hazard trees, I've never been terribly good at it, and the only trees that I can detect by sounding are ones that are extremely hollow. Also like to point out that sometimes one particular species is particularly decay prone, and you just kind of need to keep an eye on that as you're going through the process. We also do like to point out that you're coring or drilling only when necessary. You do try and focus this on the spot around the evaluation that you're conducting. So let's say you have an opening or a wound in the tree. That's where you're going to be doing your coring first. We're trying to determine how extensive the decay is around something that you're noticing from the outside. And you might also be doing it around the base of the tree if it's got butt rot, But fundamentally, you're trying to determine at the particular spot that you think that it's most effective, how much defect is in there. You also need to recognize that you're not going to be able to get to decay that's way up in the bowl. Okay, so this is a good picture from Al Shigo from his book about why you might want to do this only when necessary. This particular tree had a small column of decay relative to the sound wood that was on the outside. And then slightly off the plane where this slice was taken, the tree was increment cored. And then the decay started to spread. So fundamentally what you're doing when you're drilling or increment coring a tree with decay in it is if you get into that compartmentalized pocket of decay, like in this example, you're not only breaking the tree's defensive barrier, but you're basically dragging infected wood right back through your sound wood. So anytime you core or drill a tree, you're doing significant damage. Okay, so a few things about decay, and particularly decay in heartwood in trees. Also would like to point out a few fruiting bodies and give you an idea of how you can tie that information to what's in chapter 4. One point I did want to make is focused on that picture on the lower left there, and that's talking about saprots. And this is mostly going to be a situation that you see in dead trees. Dead trees tend to rot from the outside in. Living trees are going to be a lot of times, in some degree or another, trying to battle against the decay. And if you look at that picture on the upper left there, that's a tree that went through that full process of compartmentalization and moved it off into the center of the tree. So when the tree dies, all those defensive actions then stop and the tree rots from the outside in. Also, if it had decay on the inside, that decay is then going to spread as well. Okay, conchs and mushrooms, using the specific ones to identify which decay you have. Fundamentally, you have to be able to recognize which conch it is and then tie it to the information in chapter 4. And it gives you a couple of examples there. We are in some cases going to be using the number and location of conchs in order to make a failure potential determination. Okay, so a wound with visible decay is a pretty obvious thing that you're going to be looking for in hazard trees, like the picture on the left. One thing that I did want to point out is that there's two fundamentally different types of decay processes. White rot type organisms have enzyme systems which are capable of breaking down both the cellulose backbone in wood, and the lignin in wood. So they cause more complete degradation and make the wood very soft and spongy. As compared to brown cubicle decay type organisms, which have only fundamentally one enzyme system capable of breaking down the wood, they do, however, do it much more quickly than white rots do. However, it's not going to be causing as complete a degradation, and in a lot of cases, that material is still left there in place. However, just to complicate matters, it is not at all unusual to have more than one type of decay going on in a particular piece of wood. Taking you over to the picture on the left there, that area right in the lower bowl of the tree is particularly problematic when you're trying to identify what decay might be present there. In that particular chunk of wood, you might have root diseases coming up from the ground. You might have stem decay coming from up above. You might have a relatively recent wound with decay organisms just invading from the outside. And you might have heart rot that's already in there. So that particular butt area is really problematic to determine what's going on. Okay, so we're going to talk about rating decays, and it's a 1 to 4 system again, and we're using a 15% sound shell threshold if there's no opening to the outside of the trees. So there's going to be fundamentally different approaches to evaluating how much decay is in the tree. Excuse me, I said that incorrectly. Developing how sound the tree is, determining whether or not the tree has an opening first. So no opening is 15% sound shell, and when an opening is present, you have to use a 20% sound shell. And if you look at 4D there, it spells that out quite a bit. And 3Ds are going to be exceeding that 15% threshold without an opening. When an opening is present, you're going to be exceeding the amount of sound shell over 20%. In a 2D, so a tree that you're not going to be giving a very high failure potential rating, we bump that up to 30% to be firmly sure that you're not anywhere near this. There may be situations where you're at like 25%, in which case you're going to bump it up to 25, or you're going to bump it up to 2 most of the time. But we wanted a firm threshold on the 2D so that you can establish that this is a tree that's not very likely to fail. Okay, so why are we looking at sound wood shell? It's basically a way of determining the strength at the decay site. And it depends on the sound ratio of sound wood to decayed wood. It can be checked by coring or drilling, only when necessary. If we are getting into this process, we're asking you to do it in 3 or 4 different locations and then averaging those numbers. Okay, so the other point I wanted to make with this is a determination that excludes the bark. And what you then need to do if you're taking a coring, it's pretty simple to measure how wide the bark is, and then you simply subtract that number from the DBH. But all the tables and everything that are given in our book are based on without the bark present. Okay, just to give you an idea of what that might look like, this would be the threshold for an FP3 versus an FP4. No opening, you're looking at a 15% of the diameter. And that's just basically this much wood from here to here. If you have over 15% sound wood shell, that'd be about what it looks like. At 20%, again, giving you an idea of what that might look like. And this is 20% of the total diameter of the wood moving across in the situation where you have a tree with an opening. And this table on page 14 lays this process out for you fairly simply. Let's go work through an example where we have a 20-inch tree. Okay, a 20-inch tree with an opening, in which case you need a 20% sound shell, and look into the table and you can see simply that that's 4 inches. This 30% also highlighted there just to point out that if you want to firmly be sure that this tree is in a 2D category, that's the depth to which you would need to drill. Okay, so this is just a graphic showing a tree with an opening 20 inches in diameter. That's the limit of the decay. In this case, simply, you have an opening on the outside, and you can probably just measure the sound wood that's visible in the opening. Or looking into the cavity, and you can see how deep that is. It might also be a good idea if you went around to the back side of the opening and took one decay sample over there. But you can simply just measure how much sound wood is around this opening there, and use that as one of your measurements. Okay, so is the sound wood shell greater than 4 inches? Just visualizing that process for you, that circle shows about a 4-inch depth. We're saying in this case that we do not have a shell that is exceeding 4 inches, in which case it would be a failure potential 4. Okay, example with no opening and a 28-inch diameter. At this case, we're going to be looking for a 4.2-inch sound shell in order to determine that the tree is still got a reasonable degree of structural soundness. And that's the depth that you might need to drill to be totally sure that it's in an FP2. So what does that look like? Let's say in this case that we took 3 different drillings or corings, and those are the thicknesses of sound wood shell that we determined. We averaged those together and found that they're 3.9. 3.9 is less than 4.2, the 15% number, and we would again give that a very high rating. Okay, so it is very important that you get involved in a practice in this process. You have to visualize how much sound wood you might be having. All of the examples, to lay them out for you graphically here, are fairly simple. A lot of times decay is pretty irregular within the tree. And you need to get out and practice doing that and get your hands on some trees in order to determine accurately whether you're coming up with a good sound wood shell number. So just comparing the tree on the right to the one on the left, pretty obvious to my eyes that the one on the right, you're not coming up with a sound wood shell. And the one on the left, you're exceeding that 20% threshold that you would have even with an opening. So this would be something where you're knocking it down into a 2. Okay, sometimes you use conchs as decay indicators when you know which particular decay organism it is that you're dealing with. And that would be referring you to chapter 4. You look up the characteristics of that particular decay organism in chapter 4, and then you can use some of that information for determining whether or not it's in the various failure potential categories based on the number of conchs. Okay, so this one is a pine-eye conch. It's found on page 43, and this is the blue box from page 43. And I already talked through some of this process here already. In this particular case, we're finding a number of different conchs on the tree, and I'll show you how that plugs into the form here. So in this case, we have a Doug fir that's 15 inches in diameter. We're noticing 2 pine-eye conchs at approximately 5 foot. We're not determining the sound wood shell. We're going to be using the presence of those conchs to make our determination. And from that blue box, we get that that's falling into a 3D category. And then we're going to go through the rest of our rating and make that come out to be a total hazard tree rating of 9. In this case, again, having a removal recommendation is probably a sound idea. And we move on. Okay, so let's talk about a different fungal organism and how you might use decay indicators. Indian paint conch is found on page 42. And if you there, you notice right off the bat that a failure potential 4 is achieved when you only have 1 conch on the tree. I've quite commonly seen this where it's well up in the crown of the tree. Nonetheless, if you have any conchs at all of this particular fungus, we know from a lot of tree sampling and a lot of experience that even if you only have 1 conch, it's going to have a ton of rotten wood. So we're going to put that in a 4D. Just work you through how that goes into a form. We have an 8-inch grand fir in this case, and we did note 1 Indian paint conch, in this case up at 30 feet. So it's well up into the crown of the tree. We're not going to be determining sound wood shell again. We're coding that a 4 based on the presence of the conch, and it's going to be a maxed out hazard tree rating of 10. And again, we're going to get to a removal recommendation. Okay, so we're moving off of decay and on to leaning trees. A few important things to think about when we're talking about leaning trees. One is the top vertical? And there's a process of correction that trees do when they're pushed off of vertical or something causes them to lean. And I'll talk about that process a little bit here. And what we're talking about is what I call corrected growth. The old forestry term for it is sweep, basically describing the curvature or sweep in a tree. And we're comparing that to uncorrected growth. So let's imagine we have a perfectly straight up and down tree. Something causes it to lean off vertical. Then given enough time, the tree top will grow back up towards vertical again. And that's how this process of sweep develops. It's also important to measure the degree of lean within the tree. And the critical number that we're throwing at you here is 15% of lean. And if we're exceeding that threshold, we're going to be bumping up our failure potential ratings. We're also looking for other evidence like soil cracks, movement, sprung roots. I'll show you a picture of what that looks like here in a minute. Also wanted to point out that lean is a cause of a major interacting factor. If you have things like root disease or decay in an area that might be impacted by the lean, definitely a strong interacting factor when you have lean. Fundamentally, you're putting additional structural load on that tree. Okay, so lean or sweep, this is the process of how we go through and rating that. If you see some of those factors like soil cracked or lifted or root breakage, it's going to be in a 4. Soil looks intact, but we have an uncorrected lean exceeding 15 degrees, it's going to be in a 3. And a 2 is corrected leans without any of those other additional complications. Okay, so what is a leaning tree with cracked soil or mounded soil? What does that look like? And that's the situation here. You can actually see a big crack in the soil. Sometimes you can see the mounding without the obvious crack. Sometimes you can actually see the roots popping right up out of the ground. What's happened in this scenario is that the tree has started to lean due to whatever cause. It might have been wind load. It might have been process of root disease, rotting off all of the roots around the tree, but something has caused it to lean, and then the root system is fundamentally pushing its way up through the ground, expressing the fact that this is a tree that's on its way to the ground. And that's going to be in a 4L. Okay, so looking at a couple of leaning trees, and this slide is a little bit subtle, so I'd like to spend just a little minute on it. And the tree on the left there, if you look at the top, you can see fundamentally that it's not really growing back up towards vertical again. Versus the tree on the right, a little bit of curvature there, and that tree is again growing vertically. If you lay out a 15-degree angle onto this slide, that's approximately what it looks like. In this case, that tree is not exceeding that 15-degree angle. One on the right is pretty darn close to 15 degrees, but I still think not quite exceeding that 15-degree angle. So this is how we would go through and put that process on the form. And there's a couple of things in here that I would like to mention. First one, we're going to talk about that tree that had the lean with the cracked soil. That's a 21-inch ponderosa pine. We're going to put an F in that failed box. We're saying that that's a tree that needs immediate attention, and it's going to be, despite the fact that we're not going to really have a very high target value, it's near a path rather than a high impact zone. We're saying that this is a tree that's on its way down, and we want to deal with it anyway. And we're going to be having a total rating of 8, but making a removal recommendation anyway. Okay, those next two trees, one with corrected lean, less than 15 degrees, and one with an uncorrected lean, less than 15 degrees. For that case, our total defect rating is a 2, and our total hazard tree rating is going to come out as a 6. This particular form, it's saying monitor at this point. Actually, if I were doing this functionally, I wouldn't even put monitor on those trees. I'm just going to say probably they're okay and move on. Point or two on slenderness, height to diameter ratio. And the way that we calculate this is a ratio in between tree height and diameter, both in feet. So for example, if you had a 60-foot high tree, 6 inches in diameter or 0.5 foot, it has an overall slenderness ratio of 120. And just because these trees are so skinny, probably developed in a very tight canopy, they're much more likely to blow down. And this is going to be in a failure potential code 4L. And the slenderness ratio just gives you a graphic picture of what that might be looking like. And a failure potential 4 for that over exceeding 100, a 3 for over 80, and a 2 for over 60. Okay, stem damage and wounds. This actually takes into account a number of different sorts of damages, but they're all rated similarly, so they're kind of lumped together into this category. We're going to walk through one by one. Cracks are a particularly tricky and dramatic sort of forest defect, and I'm going to try and explain how we go about looking at those. There are a number of different things that can cause a crack. You can get frost cracks, lightning strikes can cause cracking, wind shake can cause cracking. What we're really looking for, however, is structural failure cracks. And these are signs of some deep defect in the wood, indicating that the wood has been under a ton of structural load. Also like to point out that vertical and horizontal cracks mean something different. when you have a horizontal crack going across the grain, that means that that piece of wood is broken. Wood with a vertical crack means that it's in the process of breaking, might not have entirely failed yet. And cracks, particularly vertical ones, are most serious if you get independent movement on two sides of that caused by wind, indicating that you have two separate pieces of wood that are not in any way fused together, and the tree is in the process of breaking. Okay, a picture of what cracks look like. This is very common in true fir trees. This one is a little tricky to see, the structural failure crack on the right. Pardon me, having some allergy issues. But anyway, right down from this V fork here, you have a crack coming out of that runs all the way down into this area right there. And that's a structural failure crack. And we'll talk a little bit about V forks here in just a minute too. This is another structural failure crack in the butt of a tree. In this case, something has put that tree under serious structural load. A lightning scar, in my experience, if lightning doesn't basically blow the tree up, the scars that you get from it are not terribly consequential cracks. And we're going to be putting those down in a 2. You can sometimes get hidden structural cracks. One of my colleagues up in Coeur d'Alene has come across these fairly frequently. And if you increment core into that area where you saw crack indications and resins on the outside, he found that there was a hidden structural crack that you could see in increment coring. Okay, so looking at cracks and how we would be rating those. The important part is the 3 versus the 4. And a structural crack with evidence of independent movement is going to be in a 4. And a structural crack without movement is going to be in a 3. Also notice, please, that we're bringing in the element of sound wood shell diameter in there as well at the 3 level. And we also bring it in to the second part of the description in the 4W, but I'll get into that in a minute. Okay, at a 2, we're only going to be talking about small, shallow cracks, and we're saying have a good sound wood shell. Okay, so let's walk through the process of looking at that. In this case, we have a 21-inch Doug fir. Has a deep crack, but it has no movement, but it does have an uncorrected lean. The sound wood shell is fine, but we're saying that we have 2 different defects. 1, we're seeing a crack, but 2, we're also having a lean, and so we're going to bump it up 1 category based on those 2 interacting defects and make that a failure potential 4. Everything else is maxed out, and the total rating is going to be a 10. And we're going to recommend to remove it. Okay, we're going to talk briefly about fire. And sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with one of the boxes on my screen here, getting in the way of what I'm trying to read. This is something that's seen on natural resource sites in some cases, and there are rules of thumb for evaluating how much damage is done by fire. And we're using that in a couple of different ways here. Sorry, this box that's popping up here is blocking my view of the screen. Okay, so there we're back on track. We're going to be looking at fire scars here, and one fundamental number that we're going to be using to break something out into the highest defect category is if more than 50% of the circumference is damaged. In a 3, we're talking about still having 50 to 75% of the wood still structurally there, and it goes down from there. Okay, this is just highlighting what I just said, the 50 to 75% in a 3, and less than 50% sound wood present in a 4. And this is just a graphic showing you what that might look like, and it's on page 13 of the guide. If you're seeing this much fire damage on the tree, it's actually pretty dramatic. Sound wood, it's going to be most times pretty obvious if you have the sound wood shell still intact. Okay, I'm going to talk about wounds versus canker diseases. This is our wound picture from before on the left there, and a canker disease on the right. Cankers are fungal diseases of a different sort than decays. They function in the cambium area, and they cause a spreading mortality of the tree in the cambium area. They can quite frequently kill the tree. There are various rates of spread and levels of pathogenicity of the different canker diseases. Some are fairly slow moving, some are fairly aggressive and can kill a tree in only a couple of years, or even only in 1 year if the tree is under a lot of environmental stress. But they're also a significant source of defect, and they're also a source of a wound. Decay organisms can invade right in on top of canker diseases. The canker split up here is actually pretty simple. If the tree is killed by the canker disease, we're going to call it a 4. We're not going to make it a 3 until over 50% of the stem is girdled. Okay, a few words on forked tops. And what we're talking about with forked tops is when we have a narrow angle, or what we call a V-shaped fork that develops in trees. And in that situation, what we have happening is the two pieces of wood have a very tight angle in between the two stems. And in that case, you actually get bark that folds down inside of that narrow angle, and it leads to a fundamental structural weakness within the tree. When you have that embedded bark, bark tissue never fuses to other bark tissue. So you have two stems with only bark tissue touching. You never get the functional structural strength that you have when wood is present. And wood can fuse to wood, but bark cannot fuse to bark. Okay, so this is what that looks like. One picture on the left is a relatively strong U-shaped fork, and the picture on the right are some weak V-shaped forks. And the same sort of thing can go on with branch attachments. You can get wider angles that are relatively strong, or you can get weak ones that are V-shaped, and you can get bark folded down inside of those. This is basically a tree blew out with one of those tight V forks in it. And you can see inside of this that that's basically where you would have noticed that the two trees were forming a separate stems. But in between that, this is bark tissue folded all the way down inside of this V fork. And it's fundamental weakness in a tree. Oops. Okay, we're also going to talk a little bit about branches and tops, dead branches. They're particularly defective when they're decayed, dead, even worse when they're detached. We call those widowmakers. And if they're broken, most of the times they're a hardwood problem. We've had some of our most serious problems on cottonwoods and developed recreation sites in the Western US. I know of at least 3 either fatality or serious injury related issues that have come up with dead cottonwood branches. Fundamentally, what happens with a cottonwood is they get to be about like 60 to 80 years old and they start dying back from the top. And they're large, massive trees, and you end up with big hunks of wood that are located 60, 80 feet up into the air. Pretty serious and consequential defect. Some of the other features that we're looking for is damage allowing decay to enter into the site. We're looking at tree architecture to a certain degree, odd angles within the crown. Decay can be visible sometimes, but quite often it's fairly cryptic inside of live tissues surrounding the dead branches. Okay, so we have this extensive text here on cottonwood and branches here. One point that I'd like to make at this point is that we're making a 3-inch diameter threshold, and we're not really going to be looking at trees that aren't larger than 3 inches in diameter. We're just not seeing very many situations where those are problematic. So if you have a 3-inch living branch of a cottonwood or a birch, And tying that together with evidence of breakage or decay, that's going to be in a 4, a 3-inch diameter branch, just based on the fact that there's evidence of crown breakage, but we're not seeing decay. We're going to put that in a 3. And 2 and above, we may be seeing some living branches that show some small degree of evidence of past damage, but we're not looking at consequential decay or breakage. That's going to be something that falls into a 2. Okay, so we're going to move on at this point to dwarf mistletoe brooms. And this also falls into that branches category. These are really only going to be a significant problem if you get really large, massive dwarf mistletoe brooms. And this happens most dramatically in Douglas fir in this area. Large mistletoe brooms are a separate category in chapter 4. Notice that there is a specific species-specific element to this. An FB4 deals only with Douglas fir large brooms greater than 10 inches in diameter, 10 feet in diameter, or dead brooms in other species. So we're only talking about some really large, massive things, or if they're dead in a failure potential 4. Cracked ones, we're going to put ordinarily in a 3 on other species other than Douglas fir. Dead tops are another issue here. Dead tops are kind of a tricky thing to rate. Failure potential depends on the species, and particularly those species that have a tendency to be resinous and decay resistant. Those we're pointing out that they have lower failure potential values. If you get into true firs and hemlocks and hardwoods, dead tops are a much more consequential thing. Resinous species tend to be able to hang on to dead tops for a pretty long period of time. Some interacting factors that we're going to be looking for when talking about dead tops are cracks or decay. If those are present, it's going to bump it up a category. We're also going to talk about root disease a little bit. We have some things like undermined roots, cases where there's evidence that you can see rot at the surface of the root. Severed roots also enters into this, and we're also going to be talking about root disease. Various kinds of root damage are spelled out in this section on the back of your form. Root damage, decay, a lot of text in here, including some readings, and so I broke this text out into the bottom of this slide for you to make it a little bit easier to look at. Root damage or decay, root mechanical damage, our thresholds are going to be 50 and 75% levels of undamaged roots, and point out that you have to have damage on over 50% of the root system in order to get it into a failure potential level 4. Fire damage, the way that that's usually rated is on a quadrant system, and so you're fundamentally dividing the area around the root system of the tree into 4 quadrants when you suspect that you might have fire damage, and then applying that to the rating system. And then we do have a way of looking at aggressive root diseases as well. And if we're talking about aggressive root disease, that's going to be a very serious and consequential defect. What I would like to make is trees can compensate, not only in the root system, but the overall tree as well. And it's important to look at the entire root system. It turns out that in this situation, where the root system is not supported from underneath, and you can commonly see this along road cuts and stream banks, the uphill roots are more important for keeping that tree upright than the downhill roots. So you can use a lot of the downhill side of the root system and still have a tree that's relatively structurally sound. Okay, so in situations where something might be cutting into the root system, so like the photograph here was taken in a public park, and in the bottom of the slide you can see that there's some brand new paving there. What happened with this is they came in and dug out the area for the paving, and they cut the root system off in the tree, give it a couple of years, and then that tree blew over. Notice also that that tree had a large, healthy crown in the situation where part of the root system had been cut off. And there are a bunch of different things that can damage the root system. Increase in the water table, decay or disease, something like construction damage that's coming in and cutting off roots. Erosion or physical damage of various sorts can also damage root systems. Okay, so root diseases are caused by fungi that live underground, and wanted to put together a little special section on these because a lot of people have a limited understanding and they're difficult to detect because they are largely underground. They attack and kill tree roots, and they cause them to decay as well. They weaken trees and predispose them to other agents that might be killing them, like bark beetles and that sort of thing. And they are what we call diseases of the site. Once you get a root disease in a particular area, fundamentally it never really goes away. And there's some specificity in regards to which trees are infected by which root diseases. Okay, so campground area, one of the things that you really want to keep an eye on is what has happened in the past. If you do have stumps present and there might be evidence of decay in there, stumps are kind of a little window into the underground world. So if you're in an area you've been cutting trees out in the past, look at the stumps and they'll quite commonly give you evidence that root disease was present. You can also look at root balls that are on the site and examine the roots that have been ripped up out of the ground. Gives you another way of looking at the root system, and then you can apply that information to other trees. And sometimes you can also see bark beetle attacks. Bark beetles do have a tendency to be drawn to trees that are infected with root diseases. Okay, a few other indicators specifically on the left side of the picture. Those are some of the fruiting bodies of a couple of root diseases. One on aspen, one on a conifer. You also can get symptoms of a thinning crown associated with root disease, and you can get resin flows right at the base of the tree sometimes, indicating that that area right at the root collar is dying. Also, if you look at the picture on the lower right, that's a tree that blew over that had a lot of root disease in it. You can see those tree roots are rotted and basically falling apart. Okay, so when we have aggressive root disease, any diagnostic symptom of aggressive root disease on a tree is going to put it into a failure potential category 4. If it's only suspected because an adjacent tree has it, then you're going to be falling back into a failure potential category 3. So root diseases in a recreation site are something that we take very seriously. This just gives you an idea of what that resinosis symptom might be looking like on a little bit closer. Resin stain at the base of the tree, and you can also see some thinning crowns sometimes. Okay, some other sources of root damage here. We already mentioned this briefly, but root exposure, our critical thresholds are going to be the 50 and 75% level of sound roots. And fire damage, we mentioned that process of splitting it up into quadrants. And aggressive root diseases versus butt rot. Okay, getting real close to the end here, yay. Talk a little bit about skills improvement, and I do like to emphasize that this is a learned skill and it has to be done by getting out there and touching some trees. Fundamentally, you learn the general stuff and then you start getting into the specifics. Great deal of variation as to what the problems might be by location. Can vary widely from site to site how much rot is associated with particular diseases. And then that chapter 4 that we've provided you with is a very useful resource. I think it's critically important to get out and work with sawyers, examine trees that you've made recommendations on as they're being cut. You want a great resource for how much damage and defect and decay is in a tree. A great place to get it is someone who's running a chainsaw into a tree on a regular basis. They're the ones that really are going to know what they look like on the inside. And practice, practice, practice. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? You need to practice. This is a very, very old quote that I love from Confucius. And it's, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. you have to get out there and get your hands on some trees, touch them, and you start appreciating the process of how defect develops. Okay, so one final slide here, and that's just pointing out where our various offices are for forest health protection. I'm located in Ogden, Utah, and my service area is the states of Utah and Nevada and a little bit of Wyoming. We have another office that's located in Boise, and my colleague Angel is up there, and they primarily deal with public lands that are located in southern Idaho. We have offices in Coeur d'Alene, which mostly covers northern Idaho, and then we have another office in Missoula, which deals with Montana and with North Dakota. And I would encourage you to contact any of these folks listed on the left there and talk with them about doing a field session to follow up on this webinar. Okay, that's all. I'd like to say thank you for everyone for their attention. And if we had any questions, I'll give it my best shot.
John, do you want to take a 10-minute break or a 5-minute break before the Q&A session, or what do you think about that?
Let's just dive right in.
Let's dive right in. Okay, you got it. So I'm going to have you open up the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. You could either stop sharing, and then you'll be able to see the Q&A down there, and we can just dive right in.
Okay, so Alexander, interesting question.
So I'm going to have you, maybe if you could read the question for our audience, and then that will help everybody who's maybe calling in. We have a couple phone call-in listeners as well.
Okay, so Alexander asked the question, how do you define the term for monitor? Is just saying monitor enough? So monitor, to my mind, means a tree that you're going to come in and look at again when you repeat your survey. So just saying monitor is not enough. Saying monitor implies that you're going to be looking at that tree again.
Great.
And I'm sorry, the next question in here is, why do you use invasive increment coring or drilling before sounding with a mallet? And if I did give that impression, I was incorrect. You would do something like sounding after, I said that exactly backwards. That's probably why that you got that impression. You would only do invasive increment coring or drilling after you had sounded with a mallet. Sounding with a mallet would determine a massive hollowness in a tree. And you're only going to be doing increment coring or drilling in situations where you need that information in order to make a critical determination in between those different failure potential categories. I found, as I've gone through the years of doing this process, that I increment core or drill much less over time, and most of the time I can make a determination that I need to make without making any holes in trees.
Perfect. Hey, John, I'm going to interrupt for you for just 1 second. Sorry, guys. So we have about 240 people joining us right now. I'm going to launch a poll very quickly. And before anybody leaves the meeting room, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on the webinar that we just conducted today. And if you don't want to take the poll right now, no worries. Just move it off your screen. But if your participation in these polls helps us do our job better. So, okay, thank you. And I'm going to answer, as you answer these questions, John, I'll just answer them live and move them off the screen for you.
Okay, so Alexander asked another question. And why would you core into a wound when you break through the wall and open up the tree to more decay? Why not just prod to see what is soft or open or voids? And if you can, make the necessary determination based on that type of poking and prodding, Alexander. I strongly encourage you to go that way. You don't need to be drilling in or coring trees unless it's driving a critical piece of information. I go through the methods of explaining how you do that when you're teaching a class like this, because sometimes you need to know, but it is something that you do only when necessary. Okay, Carl asks, any thoughts for urban foresters dealing with tree decay and hazard risks? I would encourage someone who is in an urban setting to look at a number of different hazard tree rating systems. I walked you through one system today, but I would encourage you to look at, first and foremost, the ISA system of dealing with urban type situations. There are a number of other hazard tree rating systems from the Forest Service as well. I think a lot of information can be gained by comparing the different systems. The Rocky Mountain region in the U.S. Forest Service also recently put out a new hazard tree guide as well. And I would encourage you to take a look at that system and compare it with ours and compare it with what ISA does. Okay, Mark asks, is there a form for the Pacific Northwest region available? And yes, there is. One of my colleagues on HEL worked on that system as well, and then also helped to develop the system that we're talking about today. And I cannot, off the top of my head, remember all of the authors, but I know that Greg Phillip was, I believe, the senior author. And they've had that system in place for a couple of years now. But yes, there is one available for the Pacific Northwest. Okay, Alice asked, how do you quantify root damage by root size? How many large roots greater than 2 inches in diameter can be lost before stability is adversely affected? Okay, Alice, in answering that question, I know we got a little bit rushed there at the end. I was kind of trying to push through that in order to make my webinar come out on time, so I didn't address that adequately. What we're trying to do in this system is we're basing it on the proportion of the root system that's damaged on a percentage basis. We're not counting roots, we're looking at thresholds of 50 and 75%. So I'm only going to say that I'm going to have a serious amount of root damage if more than half of the root system has been damaged by any sort of decay. Oops, I'm having an issue with the poll here.
Sorry, John, move it off the screen. Sorry.
Okay.
We have to have 3 separate polls because my questions got a little skewed or mixed up. So move those aside, don't worry about them, and I have to launch 3 different ones. So hang tight, everybody. Oh, and by the way, we have John for another hour. So if you have questions, don't be shy. Put them in the Q&A window. And now's your time to ask the experts. So feel free. Go for it.
Okay, so just finishing up with that question from Alice. So what we consider to kind of be our critical levels is if more than 50% of the root system has been damaged or decayed, then we're taking that into a failure potential category 4. 50 to 75%, we're going to call that a defect category 3. And then I would encourage you to just look through the back of page 72, and you can see a little bit more detail on that there. Bill asks, has there been a species profile developed for forest trees? I'm not entirely sure what that's asking, if there has been a species profile in regards to how hazardous they might be. I don't believe that there has been. There is a lot of little pieces of information out there from different sources, but I don't think that anyone has ever unified that into one place. So I'm gonna, I guess, have to say no, or no to the best of my knowledge. Okay, so I'm sorry, Mark, if I got a little fast with the numbers there at the end. First off, I'd ask you to run through those numbers again. Let's just go backwards here.
Yeah, feel free to share your screen if you want to reference something again. It's easy enough. We got time.
Okay. Okay, this is the point where we have the old guy trying to work the technology.
No, you're fine. Remember the bottom, so share screen. Yep, there you go.
Okay. And I'm going to go back and look at some of those numbers. I'm kind of going to take a guess here that you were questioning about the root systems. So I'm trying to skim to that.
So yeah, his question was root crown excavation techniques. Do you have any suggestions for that?
In this, walking through the numbers again, for root damage and root disease, I'm going to start at the bottom there. And our threshold for roots exposed, decayed, or substantial damage is greater than 50%. And we're saying that you're not going to be in that highest defect category until you're over 50% of the root system that's damaged. We're also going to say that if you do have fire damage, specified by quadrants, basically we're more than one quadrant is fire damaged, it bumps up into a failure category 4. And also, if the tree has some symptoms of aggressive root disease, that's also going to be in a 50, in that highest category as well. Trees with butt rot or trees that don't fall into a minimum sound wood shell of 15% are also going to be in a 4. 3s could be still having 50 to 75% of the root system intact, or fire damage only within one quadrant, or aggressive root disease not present but maybe confirmed on a nearby tree, and maybe perhaps with butt rot but still having a sound wood shell in the 15 to 25% range. Okay, hopefully that got to that question. Okay, so Julie asked is it possible to purchase the documents that we were talking about? And the even better news than that is that they are free. All you have to do is just download it and you can use it. It is public domain.
I'll put the link in the chat window again. So for I messed up the link before. There was something attached to the end of it, so I'll put it in there right now.
Okay, Kelly asked a question and then answered it herself. She was asking for the name of the field guide for Pacific Northwest, and then she put it out there. It is a field guide for hazard tree identification and mitigation on developed sites in Oregon and Washington forest, published in 2014. The author on that one is Greg Phillip. Elena asked, do you know of forms or assessment methodology specific to the Northeast? And yes, Elena, the Forest Service office for the Northeast area of the Forest Service has the system for this. They do have a website, and actually if you Google forest health and Northeast area, it will take you right to that. You look for the hazard tree section within that particular web page.
Sorry, John, I'm going to do the last poll. I promise this is the last one. Okay, so just got to move it off your screen. Last one. Okay. Appreciate it. Okay, Glenn was asking, it was my understanding that if less than 20% of the diameter was experiencing decay, the tree was unlikely to fail. Yet John is saying if the live wall is greater than 20% of the diameter of the tree is healthy, the tree is unlikely to fail. That is 1/2 as there should be healthy live wall or all around the tree. And he's asking for comments and for clarity. Okay, let me just see if I can find
my picture in that and try and do a little bit better job of explaining it. Okay, so these are the pictures that I was going through, and there's two different ways that we need to be thinking about this. One without openings and one with openings. And I'd asked you to please think about the total diameter of the tree versus just the shell. And the shell is basically taking the amount of wood that would be needed for that whole tree to be sound and dividing it by 2, because we're only looking at half of the sound wood shell. So that part plus that part. So for a tree with a cavity, we're saying that 20% plus 20%, if you added those up, that would be 40% of the tree needs to be in sound wood shell if the tree has an opening within it. And oops, I went a little bit too far. In a case where you have no opening, we're going to be saying that the sound wood shell, so this distance from here to here needs to be at least 15% in order for that tree to be structurally sound. If you're thinking about the entire diameter of the tree, it would be that 15% plus this 15% still need to be in sound wood for that tree to be structurally sound. So in this case, it's lower than that threshold. We're approaching it on a shell basis rather than thinking about the overall tree diameter. And I think that might be what causes some of the confusion here. Okay, so Kelly mentioned, this isn't really a question, it's just giving a citation, that the Forest Service Region 6, I guess their webpage.
So if folks want that, it's the link to the Region 6 Hazard Tree Field Guide. So if you're interested in that hyperlink, Kelly put it in there, and I reposted it in our chat window, so folks can just grab it. So good to go with that one. Okay,
so Alexander asked, and it just disappeared.
Sorry, it's there. Just scroll up a little bit. Got it.
Okay. How would you assess the likelihood, I'm guessing, of a wind-thrown tree outside the target zone striking and causing other trees to fall toward a target, or a multi-wind-blown type situation? So, in other words, the kind of the old domino effect. And putting together 5 plant pathologists who are the authors for the publication that we're talking about here, we really, between our 5 brains, could only think of a couple of times in all of our experience where we've ever seen that happen. It is out there in the literature that you can get this kind of domino effect. It's best documented in the literature on a functional forestry sort of sense. Like if you're conducting a timber sale, what's the risk that this tree that I'm cutting down is going to strike the tree next to it and then cause that tree to fall over, and then fall over and cause a safety risk for someone who is 2 entire tree heights away? And if you're falling trees, the recommendation in that kind of scenario is that you stay at least 2 tree heights away. But on a half-tree basis, we're just seeing that situation to be vanishingly rare, and so rare that we just define our potential impact zone at a 1 tree level just because we think it's really not very likely. Okay, Lisa asked, will Megan be recording the entire webinar, and will it be available? Megan,
Yep.
You want to answer that?
Yeah, so I'm just putting the link to the webinar in the chat pod now. Folks can just, if you subscribe to our email list, you will get a link when in the next probably week or so when your web recording is up on our website. So folks can just grab that forestry.usu.edu link in the chat window and save that, and in probably tomorrow, by tomorrow, your webinar will be posted. But I try and send out a few, just only a couple few emails every month. So yeah.
Okay, so Troy asked, I encountered a link problem when I clicked on the link within the chat window and page 71 and 72, and it was not found.
Huh.
Okay, so I would ask you then, Troy, to send me an email, and it's just jguyon@fs.fed.us. Say that really fast.
I'll put your email address in the chat window, so don't worry about it, John. You're good.
Okay. And I can send you that link directly. I'm not sure what's going on with that. Okay, A. Stalker asked, do you have any recommendation for software to make detailed site plans instead of hand-scratching site plans for more detailed risk assessments? I'm going to have to say no. I don't. I'm not familiar with that. Okay, so Mark asked, how important is tree failure reporting in your opinion, particularly the International Tree Failure Database? The federal government shut that down. And that was greatly to the frustration of people that are in the hazard tree rating training business, Mark, that occurred. It is very important, and fundamentally, my job is an information dissemination type person. And when they take away your sources of information, it limits how much that you're going to be able to say. And we were very disappointed that the International Tree Failure Database went away. It was unfunded, and it was being partially covered by a different staff group within the Forest Service. But then they lost their funding, and basically they kind of abandoned it because the funding went away. Sorry, that was a great frustration for us. Okay, again, Mark asked for a link for the form. Was difficulty finding it online. It is on page 71, 72 of the guide. If you got the guide, it should have been in there, but please send me an email and I will send you a copy. Okay, someone anonymous asked, why limit the risk assessment for widowmakers to only 3 inches and only 2 species? It would be applied to all species with limbs over 3 inches in diameter. I apologize if that was incorrectly said by the end. A widowmaker, something that's hung up within the tree, that's going to be one of the most serious types of defect. I was trying to draw the attention to hardwoods in particular, saying that these sort of situations with broken branches are more likely in hardwoods, but I did not mean to give the impression that they're only present on 2 species. And it would be, widowmakers are present on all species. We're trying to draw attention particularly to things that might cause the most damage, and our experience is that branches over 3 inches in diameter are more likely to cause damage. Okay, so diameter breast height, Christine asks, is nearly always determined at 4.5 feet from the ground, with bark being included in the figure. Your assessments are based on DBH without bark, without coring, or without an injury or opening to view the sapwood DBH. How does one estimate this figure? Honestly, Christine, you can't unless you have some experience as to how thick the bark might be, in which case you could estimate. And that estimate is going to be widely variable depending on the tree species that you're dealing with. For example, ponderosa pines have very thick bark. Their bark on a 30-inch ponderosa pine might be 3 or 4 inches thick. On a lodgepole pine, you're probably talking about less than 1 inch of bark thickness. So the only way that I know of to estimate that would be either drilling into a tree or based on experience. Okay, Eric asks, do you have any experience with the IML inspection drills? And if so, do you recommend using them? I'm going to have to say I don't know what an IML inspection drill is. I'm going to take a guess. That might be something related to the resistograph type drill. And I have limited experiences. Basically, I've used them at some workshops and train the trainer type trainings, and discovered that they are extremely expensive and kind of gave away the idea of using them. So sorry, no knowledge.
Last question, if anybody else wants to chime in.
Jay Humble asks for a service handbook, and then cites the number chapter 40, suggests that a qualified person can determine when a medium priority danger tree will deteriorate to become a high priority danger tree that should be mitigated as soon as possible. Okay, I'm going to take that as a comment rather than a question because I don't see a question there.
Oh, do you have any experience in monitoring and estimating? Do you see that underneath there?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. I'll read it for him. Do you have any experience in monitoring and estimating the month and year when high priority hazards are likely to occur, as suggested in FSM for increased danger tree rating?
Okay, so a couple of things that I'm kind of getting out of that question. Part one, no, you're not going to be able to precisely estimate the month and year when high priority hazards shift from a moderate priority hazard. Hazard tree assessment is risk analysis, and exact dates and numbers are just basically not part of the risk analysis process. By ongoing monitoring, both through annual surveys and repeated hazard tree baseline surveys, is going to be the only way that I know of where you're going to be able to detect something moving from a medium priority to a high priority. And fundamentally, the only way that you're really going to be doing that is if you survey again. Somebody
put in the Pacific Northwest has a tree failure database, and they put that link into the chat window, which I think is interesting if anybody's interested in that. So I don't see any other questions. Great job, John. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day today. We had, I think at one point, about 240 people joining us. We still have 180 people chiming in, and I think that that's a great success. Alexander has one more question. If you feel like answering it, great. If you don't, no worries. But again, I really appreciate you helping and presenting today.
Okay, Alexander asks, would you think that reducing stems or trees to a wildlife stag / monolithic pole to improve wildlife habitat closer to the public areas? What would I think of that? I'm kind of guessing in there.
Probably.
I have seen presentations of that done at hazard tree train the trainer type workshops. Particularly a guy by the name of, I think it was Steve Brown out of the Pacific Northwest does that sort of thing on a regular basis and is extremely creative with it. And if you can reduce the size enough that you're taking all the structural load off the tree, yes, you can create some very innovative solutions that might be promoting wildlife habitat. Really, fundamentally, once you've reduced the size down to a relatively short pole, you probably have reduced it to something that's outside of your target area for one thing, and you've just taken all the structural stress off of it. So why not?
Great. Just a reminder that this webinar was recorded. It will be posted probably within the next 48 hours on our website. The link to that website is in your chat pod, so go ahead and grab that hyperlink. John's email is there if you have any questions that come up after the fact. And again, thank you very much for tuning in today. Thank you, John. Good job. And
all right. Thank you, Megan.
Go have a rest. No more talking for the rest of the day.
Yep. My voice is very tired. Thank you.
Yeah.